The lights of Remington's bakery glowed warmly in the chilly evening air. Alexander Remington stood behind the counter, counting the day's earnings with practiced precision. At 55, he had built his bakery into the most successful one in Boston. His salt and pepper hair and expensive suit showed a man who took pride in his appearance, just as he took pride in his business. "Another record day, sir," said Thomas, his assistant manager, gathering the empty display trays. "Excellence demands consistency," Alexander replied, not looking up from his ledger. He had repeated those words so many times over the years that they had become his motto. The sweet smell of fresh bread still lingered in the air, even though the ovens had been turned off hours ago. But something had been bothering Alexander lately. Every morning for the past week, he had found items missing from the day-old bread rack. At first, he thought it was just poor inventory management, but after installing security cameras, he discovered the truth. A small figure sneaking in through the back door late at night. "I'll catch whoever's stealing from me," he told Thomas firmly. Nobody steals from Alexander Remington. That night, Alexander decided to stay late. He turned off most of the lights, but kept the security cameras running. Hours passed and his eyes grew heavy. Just as he was about to give up, he heard a soft noise from the back door. A tiny figure slipped inside, moving with the quiet grace of someone used to staying hidden. In the dim light, Alexander could see it was a little girl, probably no more than 8 years old. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her dark hair tangled and unwashed. She headed straight for the day-old bread rack, with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Alexander flipped on the lights. The girl froze, clutching a loaf of bread to her chest like a shield. "So," he said coldly, "you're the thief who's been stealing from me." The girl didn't run. She stood her ground, though her hands trembled. "I was hungry," she said simply, her voice surprisingly steady. "Hungry?" Alexander scoffed. "That's your excuse for stealing? There are food banks, soup kitchens. They're all full," she interrupted, "or too far to walk to. And the shelter won't take us without papers." Alexander moved closer, towering over her. "Us?" For the first time, fear flickered across the girl's face. She had said more than she meant to. "Listen here, young lady, I worked hard for everything in this store. Nothing was given to me. If you want food, you pay for it like everyone else. What's your name?" "I'm calling the police." The girl's chin lifted defiantly, but tears welled in her eyes. "Lillian," she whispered. "Lillian Carter." Alexander felt like someone had dumped ice water down his back. Carter. It couldn't be. But those eyes, he knew those eyes. They were his mother's eyes, the same ones his younger brother Daniel had inherited. "Who?" His voice cracked. He tried again. "Who are your parents?" "My dad's name is Daniel," she said, "but he's sick. That's why I have to get food. He can't work anymore." Alexander grabbed the counter for support. Daniel. His little brother Daniel, whom he hadn't seen in 15 years, not since their bitter fight over the family inheritance. Daniel, who had walked away from the family business to become an artist, whom Alexander had told never to come back. "Where is he?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "In the old warehouse on Mason Street," Lillian said. "Oh, we've been living there since the hospital sent him home. He has cancer." The bread slipped from Lillian's hands as Alexander's legs gave way, and he sank into a nearby chair. All these years of building his empire, of proving he was right, and Daniel was wrong, and now this little girl, his niece, had been stealing bread just to survive. "I'm sorry," Lillian said quickly, backing toward the door. "I won't come back. Please don't call the police. Dad can't go to jail. He's too sick." "Wait!" Alexander called out, but Lillian had already disappeared into the night. Alexander sat alone in his bakery, surrounded by his success, feeling poorer than he had ever felt in his life. On the floor lay the loaf of bread that Lillian had dropped. Bread that cost him less than $2 to make, while his own brother was dying in a warehouse. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Margaret, it's Alexander. I need your help. I've found Daniel. And I think I've made a terrible mistake." The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities and second chances. But first, Alexander had to find his brother and make things right. As he locked up the bakery, He realized that for the first time in 15 years, the smell of fresh bread made him want to cry. Margaret Blake had been Alexander's secretary for 20 years, and she had never heard him sound so shaken. She arrived at the bakery within 30 minutes, her grey hair hastily pinned up, wearing a coat over her pajamas. "Mason Street Warehouse," she repeated after Alexander explained everything. "Alex, that's not a place for anyone to live, especially not someone who's sick, I know that," Alexander snapped, then immediately softened his voice. "I'm sorry, Margaret, I can't believe this is happening. My own brother living like that, and his daughter stealing bread." Margaret put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then let's go get them." The warehouse district was only 15 minutes away by car, but it felt like entering another world. The streetlights were broken, and piles of trash lined the sidewalks. Alexander's expensive car looked completely out of place. "Lillian!" he called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Lillian, it's your Uncle Alexander." For a long moment there was only silence. Then a small figure emerged from the shadows. Lillian looked even smaller on the street than she had in the bakery. "How do I know you won't call the police?" she asked, keeping her distance. "Because I'm here to help," Alexander said. "Please, take me to your father." Lillian studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She led them to a side door of the warehouse, rusted and hanging slightly off its hinges. Inside, the space was dark and cold. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. In the far corner, on a makeshift bed of blankets, lay Daniel Carter. Alexander barely recognized his younger brother. Daniel's face was gaunt, his once vibrant brown hair now thin and grey. He was only 48, but looked 20 years older. "Danny?" Alexander's voice cracked. Daniel's eyes opened slowly. "Alex," he whispered. "Is this real, or am I dreaming again?" Alexander fell to his knees beside his brother's makeshift bed. "It's real. I'm here, Danny. I'm here, and I'm so sorry." Margaret had already pulled out her phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said firmly. "No hospitals," Daniel protested weakly. "Can't afford it." "I can," Alexander said. "I will. Danny, please, let me help you now." Lillian stood watching, her small hands clenched into fists. "The doctors said he needs special medicine, but it costs too much." "Not anymore," Alexander said. He reached out and took his brother's thin hand. "Danny, I was wrong about everything. Please let me make it right." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Alex, I'm sorry too. I was too proud to ask for help, even when things got bad. And then I didn't want Lillian to know how much I'd failed her." "You haven't failed anyone," Alexander insisted. "You raised an amazing daughter. She's brave and strong, just like you always were." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its lights painting the warehouse walls in flashing red. As the paramedics loaded Daniel onto a stretcher, Alexander felt a small hand slip into his. "Will they make him better?" Lillian asked, her voice small and frightened. Alexander squeezed her hand. "We'll make sure of it, and you're coming home with me. No more stealing bread, okay?" For the first time, Lillian smiled. It transformed her whole face, making her look like the little girl she should have been all along. Margaret watched as Alexander helped Lillian into his car. "You know," she said quietly, "in 20 years I've never seen you look so much like yourself as you do right now." At the hospital, the doctors moved quickly. Daniel was admitted to a private room, and a team of specialists was called in. Alexander hadn't left his brother's side, still holding his hand as if afraid he might disappear again. "The cancer is advanced," the doctor told them privately, "but not untreatable. With aggressive therapy and proper care, there's a good chance." While Daniel slept, exhausted from all the tests and medications, Alexander sat with Lillian in the hospital cafeteria. She ate a sandwich like she was afraid it might be taken away at any moment. "You know," Alexander said gently, "I have an apartment above the bakery. It has 2 spare bedrooms. Once your dad is stronger, maybe you both would like to live there." Lillian stopped mid-bite. "Really? We could live above a bakery? And you'd never have to steal bread again," Alexander smiled. "In fact, you could help make it. Would you like that?" Lillian nodded enthusiastically, then grew serious. "Uncle Alex, why didn't you and Dad talk for so long?" Alexander sighed. "Because sometimes grown-ups can be very foolish. We fight about things that seem important at the time but aren't really important at all. I thought being right was more important than being family. I was wrong." Back in Daniel's room, Margaret had brought fresh clothes and toiletries for everyone. She fussed over Daniel like a mother hen, adjusting his pillows and making sure he was comfortable. "You know," she said to Alexander, "that apartment needs a lot of work before anyone can live there. The plumbing's ancient and the heating's unreliable." "Then we'll fix it," Alexander said simply. "We'll make it perfect for them." As night fell, over the hospital, Alexander watched his brother sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Lillian had curled up in a chair beside the bed, finally allowing herself to rest. Looking at them, Alexander realized that all his years of building his business, of proving himself successful, meant nothing compared to this moment. He had his family back, and this time he wouldn't let them go. News travels fast in a small town, and by morning, everyone knew that Alexander Remington's long-lost brother had been found. The gossip spread through the bakery like wildfire. "I heard they were living on the streets," whispered Mrs. Peterson to her friend as they picked out their morning pastries. "Poor little girl," said another customer, "stealing bread to feed her sick father." Thomas, the assistant manager, watched the gossip unfold with growing concern. He had worked at the bakery for 10 years, and he knew how much Alexander valued his reputation. "This kind of talk could be bad for business, sir." Thomas approached Alexander when he finally came in around noon, looking tired from his night at the hospital. "Maybe we should release a statement. Control the story." Alexander surprised him by laughing. "Control the story? Thomas, I don't care what people say. My brother is alive. My niece is safe. That's all that matters." But not everyone was happy about the reunion. James Warner, owner of the rival bakery down the street, saw an opportunity. He started spreading his own version of events. "Remington's gone soft," he told his customers. "Letting thieves go unpunished? What kind of example is that?" The words reached Margaret's ears, and she marched straight into Warner's bakery. "Shame on you, James Warner. That's a sick man and an innocent child you're talking about." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Daniel was already showing signs of improvement. The proper medication and care were working wonders, though the doctors warned it would be a long road ahead. "The cancer responded well to the first treatment," Dr. Roberts explained, "but we'll need to continue aggressive therapy for at least 6 months. Lillian spent her days split between the hospital and the bakery. Alexander had enrolled her in the local school, but she came straight to the bakery afterward. She proved to have a natural talent for baking. "You're doing it wrong," she told Thomas one day, watching him frost a cake. "You need to make the swirls bigger like this." She demonstrated, and even Thomas had to admit her way looked better. The apartment above the bakery was coming along nicely. Alexander had hired the best contractors in town to renovate it. New heating, new plumbing, fresh paint on the walls. He let Lillian pick the colors for her room. "Purple," she declared without hesitation, "with white clouds on the ceiling." The contractors exchanged glances, but Alexander just smiled. "Purple it is, and make those clouds look real." One evening, as Alexander was closing up the bakery, he found Lillian sitting at one of the tables doing her homework. She had changed so much in just a few weeks. Her hair was clean and neatly braided, her clothes new and proper. But it was the look in her eyes that had changed the most. No more fear, no more desperation. "Uncle Alex," she said without looking up from her math problems, "why didn't you and Dad talk for so long?" Alexander sat down across from her. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Adults always say that when they don't want to explain," she said, sounding much older than her 8 years. Alexander smiled sadly. "You're right. The truth is, your dad and I fought over money. Over this bakery, actually. Your grandfather left. It to both of us, but I wanted to run it my way. Your dad, he had different dreams. He wanted to be an artist." "He is an artist," Lillian said proudly. "He used to draw pictures for me when we couldn't afford books. He made up stories to go with them." Alexander felt his heart clench. "I'd love to see those drawings sometime. They're in his old backpack at the warehouse. We left in such a hurry, her voice trailed off. We'll go get them, Alexander promised. First thing tomorrow. But when they arrived at the warehouse the next morning, they found it cordoned off by police. A fire had broken out overnight, destroying everything inside. Lillian burst into tears. Dad's drawings, all his stories. Alexander held her close, feeling her small body shake with sobs. He looked at the burned-out building and thought about all the nights his brother and niece had spent there, cold and hungry, while he slept in, his comfortable house just 15 minutes away. Back at the hospital, they broke the news to Daniel. To their surprise, he smiled. The drawings don't matter, he said weakly. I can make new ones, better ones, and this time I'll have proper paper and pencils. Alexander cleared his throat. About that. I've been thinking. The bakery's doing well enough that we could open a small art gallery next door. Maybe sell some local artists' work, including yours when you're better. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Alex, you don't have to. I want to, Alexander interrupted. I've spent 15 years being just a businessman. Maybe it's time to be a brother again. That night, after Lillian had fallen asleep in the chair by her father's bed, Daniel turned to Alexander. You've changed, he said softly. Alexander watched his sleeping niece, thinking about how she had appeared in his bakery that night, hungry and desperate but still brave enough to face him. No, he replied. I just remembered who I used to be. And it took a little girl stealing bread to remind me. The renovation of the apartment above the bakery was finally complete. The once shabby space had been transformed into a warm, welcoming home. Lillian's purple room with its cloud-painted ceiling was perfect, just waiting for her father to come home from the hospital. But life had other plans. It started with a letter from Child Protective Services. Someone had filed a complaint about Lillian's living situation. The letter sat on Alexander's desk like a ticking bomb. They can't take her away, Margaret said firmly when Alexander showed her the letter. She's with family now. She's safe and well cared for. But I'm not her legal guardian, Alexander replied, running his hands through his hair. And Danny's still in the hospital. What if they decide she needs to go into the system? The next day, a social worker named Mrs. Thompson arrived at the bakery. She was a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose. I understand you're housing a minor without proper documentation, she said, looking around the bakery with sharp eyes. Alexander straightened his spine. Lillian is my niece. Her father is in the hospital receiving cancer treatment. Yes, I'm aware of the situation, Mrs. Thompson replied. But good intentions don't change the law, Mr. Remington. We need to ensure the child's welfare is properly protected. Just then, Lillian came bouncing down the stairs from the apartment wearing her school uniform. She stopped short when she saw the stranger. Uncle Alex, she said uncertainly. This is Mrs. Thompson, Alexander explained gently. She's here to make sure you're being taken care of properly. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened slightly as she watched Lillian help herself to a fresh muffin with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Would you like one? Lillian offered, the social worker a muffin. I helped make them this morning. Uncle Alex is teaching me how to bake. For the next hour, Mrs. Thompson interviewed Lillian, checked her school records, and inspected the apartment. She seemed particularly impressed by the purple room with its cloud ceiling. You did all this renovation for her? She asked Alexander. For her and my brother, he replied. This is their home now. Mrs. Thompson made some notes in her file. Mr. Remington, you'll need to file for temporary guardianship while your brother is hospitalized. I'll help you with the paperwork. Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but their troubles weren't over. That afternoon, James Warner showed up at the hospital. Alexander arrived for his daily visit to find Warner talking to Daniel. Think about it, Warner was saying. Your artwork displayed in my bakery. A real gallery space, not just some add-on to your brother's shop, plus a generous advance. Get out, Alexander growled from the doorway. Warner turned with a smug smile. Alex, I was just having a friendly chat with your brother about business opportunities. You're trying to steal my brother's art after spreading rumors about my family. Alexander stepped closer, his fists clenched. Dad? Lillian's voice came from behind them. She had arrived with Margaret, carrying a drawing she'd made at school. Warner's smile widened. "Ah, the little thief herself. Tell me, dear, do you still steal bread when your uncle isn't looking?" Alexander moved faster than anyone expected. He grabbed Warner by the collar and pushed him toward the door. "If you ever speak to my niece like that again—" "Uncle Alex, stop," Lillian cried out. "He's not worth it." Alexander released Warner, who straightened his jacket with a sneer. "Assault now, Alex. Wait until the social worker hears about this." After Warner left, the room was silent except for the steady beep of Daniel's monitors. "I'm sorry," Alexander said finally. "I shouldn't have lost my temper." "No," Daniel agreed weakly. "But it was kind of nice to see my big brother defending me again, just like when we were kids." Margaret took Lillian to the cafeteria for ice cream, leaving the brothers alone. "He offered me $10,000, Daniel said quietly. "For exclusive rights to my art once I'm better." "Danny, I told him no," Daniel continued. "Not because of you, Alex, but because he's the kind of man who would use a sick father and a hungry child to hurt his business rival. I don't want my art anywhere near someone like that." Alexander sat heavily in the chair by the bed. "I used to be someone like that. Before Lillian showed up in my bakery, I cared more about money than people." "But you changed," Daniel said. "Warner tried to tell me you were just doing all this for show, to look good to your customers. But I've seen how you are with Lillian, how you're trying to make things right." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Time for your treatment, Mr. Carter." As they wheeled Daniel away for his chemotherapy, Alexander sat alone in the room, looking. At the drawing Lillian had brought, a picture of 3 people in front of a bakery, all holding hands and smiling. At the bottom, she had written, "My family." The word brought tears to his eyes. Family. He had almost forgotten what that meant, lost in his pursuit of success. Now, with his brother fighting for his life and his niece's future hanging in the balance, he understood that success meant nothing without people to share it with. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Daniel's latest test results weren't good. The cancer was fighting back against the treatment, and his doctors wanted to try an experimental therapy. "It's expensive," Dr. Roberts warned, "and there's no guarantee it will work." "Money isn't an issue," Alexander said firmly. "Whatever he needs." But alone in his office above the bakery, Alexander faced the hard truth. The treatments had already cost a fortune. The apartment renovation, Lillian's school fees, and the regular hospital bills had drained his savings. The bakery was successful, but not enough to cover everything. He would have to sell something. The question was what? Margaret found him studying the bakery's financial records late that night. "The summer house," she suggested quietly. "You never use it anyway." Alexander shook his head. "Already listed it. We need more." "What about a partner?" Margaret asked. "Someone to invest in the bakery?" "No one would want to invest right now. Our profits are down since I've been spending so much time at the hospital." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Thomas, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, Mr. Warner is downstairs. He says he has a proposition for you." Alexander found James Warner sitting at one of the bakery tables, looking smug. "Come to apologize?" Alexander asked coldly. "Better," Warner smiled. "I've come to make you an offer. I'll buy your bakery, the whole thing, for twice what it's worth." Alexander stared at him. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am. Think about it. Alex, you need money for your brother's treatments. I need to expand my business. It's perfect. This bakery has been in my family for 3 generations. Warner's smile widened. "And now it's draining you dry. Face it, Alex, you can't run a successful business and play happy families at the same time. Something has to give." Before Alexander could respond, a small voice came from the stairs. "Uncle." "Alex?" Lillian stood there in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed bear. "I had a bad dream." Warner's expression turned calculating. "Ah, yes, the little thief. You know, Alex, some people might think it's inappropriate for a single man to have a young girl living in his home, even if she is his niece, especially given her history." Alexander's voice turned to ice. "Get out." "Think about my offer," Warner said, standing. "Before you lose everything trying to save people who can't be saved." After Warner left, Alexander sat with Lillian at the kitchen table, sharing warm milk and cookies. "Why was that mean man here?" she asked. "He wanted to buy the bakery. Lillian's..." eyes widened. "You're not going to sell it, are you?" Alexander looked around the kitchen where 3 generations of his family had baked bread, where he and Daniel had played as children, where Lillian now stood on a stool every morning to help make muffins. "No, sweetheart, I'm not selling." But that night he couldn't sleep. Warner's words kept echoing in his head. The bakery's accounts showed the truth. They were running out of money. The next morning he arrived at the hospital to find Daniel looking worse than ever. "The new treatment," Daniel explained weakly. "It's rough, but the doctors say that means it's working." Alexander tried to smile. "That's good." "No, it's not," Daniel said. "I heard the nurses talking. This treatment costs a fortune, Alex. You can't keep paying for it." "Watch me." Daniel grabbed his brother's hand. "I mean it, Alex. I won't let you destroy yourself for me. Not again." "What are you talking about?" "The last time you tried to save me when Dad died and I was making bad decisions. You gave up your dreams of becoming a chef in Paris. You took over the bakery instead, became the responsible one. I won't let you sacrifice everything again." Alexander sat heavily in the chair by the bed. "I never told you this, but I didn't give up anything. The bakery was my dream too. I just got lost somewhere along the way, forgot what was really important." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Thompson, the social worker. "Mr. Remington, could I speak with you privately?" In the hospital corridor, Mrs. Thompson looked serious. "We've received another complaint about Lillian's living situation. Apparently, there are concerns about your financial stability and ability to provide proper care." Alexander's heart sank. "Warner, it had to be." "I'm handling the finances," he said firmly. "Nevertheless, we need to investigate and—" She hesitated. "There's something else. Lillian's mother has come forward." Alexander felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Her mother? But Danny said she abandoned them years ago." "Yes, well, she's back now and she's filing for custody." Back in Daniel's room, Alexander found Lillian showing her father her latest school project, a story she'd written about a magical bakery where all the bread came to life at night. Looking at them together, Alexander made his decision. Warner could take his offer and choke on it. The bakery, the money, none of it mattered compared to keeping his family together. He just had to figure out how to do it. Rebecca, Carter swept into the bakery like a storm, all designer clothes and perfectly styled blonde hair. She looked nothing like the woman in the few photos Daniel had kept, the young artist who had fallen in love with his brother 15 years ago. "So, this is where my daughter has been living?" she said, looking around with barely concealed disdain. "Above a bakery?" Alexander stood his ground behind the counter. "Better than a warehouse, which is where she was living when her mother was nowhere to be found." Rebecca's perfectly painted lips tightened. "I've changed. I'm stable now. I have a good job, a nice house in California. Lillian deserves a real home." "She has a real home," Alexander replied, "with her father and her family." "Her father?" Rebecca laughed bitterly. "You mean my ex-husband who couldn't keep a job, who chose art over providing for his family, who's now dying of cancer in a hospital?" "Get out," Alexander growled, "before I forget my manners." "You can't keep me from my daughter," Rebecca said. "I have rights. Rights you gave up when you walked out on a 3-year-old girl." A small gasp made them both turn. Lillian stood at the bottom of the stairs, her school backpack clutched to her chest. "Mom?" she whispered. Rebecca's whole demeanor changed. She rushed forward, arms outstretched. "Baby, oh, look how big you've grown." But Lillian backed away, moving closer to Alexander. "Where were you? When Dad got sick, when we were hungry, where were you?" "Sweetheart, I was getting my life together, making a better life for us, and now I can give you everything you deserve." "I don't want everything," Lillian said quietly. "I just wanted my mom." Rebecca's face hardened. "Well, what you want doesn't matter. I'm your mother, and the court will see that you belong with me." After Rebecca left, Lillian burst into tears. Alexander held her close, feeling her small body shake with sobs. "I don't want to go with her," Lillian cried. "I want to stay here with you and Dad." "Then that's what will happen," Alexander promised, though his heart was heavy with worry. At the hospital, Daniel took the news of Rebecca's return hard. His already pale face turned almost gray. She can't take Lillian, he said weakly. She just can't. She won't, Alexander assured him. But later in the hospital cafeteria with Margaret, he let his guard down. What am I going to do? He asked. Rebecca has money, a stable home. All I have is a struggling bakery and a brother in the hospital. You have more than that, Margaret said firmly. You have love. You have family. And you have me. She pulled out a folder from her bag. I've been doing some research. Rebecca abandoned Lillian. She never paid child support, never even sent a birthday card. That counts against her in court. But I'm just an uncle, Alexander said. And with the bakery's finances the way they are. Then we'll fight harder, Margaret insisted. The whole town loves Lillian. They've watched her transform from a scared, hungry little girl into a happy, thriving child. They'll support us. As if to prove her point, Mrs. Peterson came into the cafeteria. I heard that woman saying she was Lillian's mother, she said. Well, let me tell you something. My women's group at church has already started a petition. We're not letting that little girl go anywhere. Word spread quickly through the small town. By evening, the bakery was full of people offering support. Thomas had organized a group of regular customers to write letters testifying to the loving home Alexander provided. The local newspaper wanted to do a story about the family's reunion and Lillian's transformation. Even James Warner seemed affected by the situation. He came to the bakery after closing time. My offer to buy the place still stands, he said. But maybe we could structure it differently, a partnership instead of a sale. You keep running the place, I provide the capital, enough to fight this custody battle and pay for your brother's treatment. Alexander stared at him suspiciously. Why would you do that? Warner looked uncomfortable. I had a daughter once, lost her in a custody battle because I couldn't afford a good lawyer. Never saw her again. Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Mr. Remington, you need to come quickly. Your brother, there's been a complication. The world seemed to spin as Alexander rushed to grab his keys. All the problems, Rebecca, the money, Warner's offer, suddenly seemed small compared to the fear in the nurse's voice. Please, he whispered as he drove through the dark streets. Please don't take him from us, not now, not when we've just become a family again. Behind him, the bakery's lights glowed warmly in the night, a beacon of hope in an increasingly uncertain world. Inside, Lillian slept under her painted clouds, unaware that her whole world might be about to change again. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Alexander ran toward Daniel's room. Margaret had picked up Lillian and was bringing her too. Daniel had asked for both of them. Dr. Roberts met them outside the room. The experimental treatment was too aggressive, she explained gently. His body couldn't handle it. We've stopped the treatment, but... But what? Alexander demanded. Without the treatment, the cancer will progress more quickly. I'm sorry, Mr. Remington. We're looking at weeks now, not months. Alexander felt his legs give way. He sank into a nearby chair, his head spinning. Weeks. Just weeks to save his brother, to keep his family together, to fight Rebecca for custody of Lillian. Inside the room, Daniel was awake but barely conscious. The machines around him beeped steadily, but his face was gray with exhaustion. Alex, he whispered. I'm here, Danny. Lillian's coming too. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I heard the doctors talking. I don't have much time. Don't say that, Alexander insisted. We'll find another treatment. I'll sell everything, get you to the best hospitals. No, Daniel's voice was weak but firm. No more treatments. I'm tired, Alex. So tired of fighting. Before Alexander could argue, Lillian burst into the room. She took one look at her father and started crying. Daddy? Daniel managed a small smile. Hey, Princess, come here. Lillian climbed carefully onto the bed, curling up next to her father like she used to do in the warehouse when they were cold and hungry. Are you going to die? She asked directly, in that way children have of cutting straight to the truth. Daniel stroked her hair weakly. Yes, sweetheart, but not right away. We still have some time. But Mom wants to take me away, Lillian cried. If you die, she'll make me go with her. No, Daniel said firmly, though the effort clearly cost him. Alex, get my bag. Alexander brought over the worn backpack that had survived the warehouse fire. Daniel pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I wrote this. When I first got sick," he explained. "Had a lawyer friend help me. It's my will and papers giving Alex full custody of Lillian if anything happens to me." Alexander took the envelope with shaking hands. "Danny, you're her family," Daniel insisted. "You and Margaret, this town, the bakery, this is her home. Rebecca gave up her rights years ago." As if summoned by her name, Rebecca appeared in the doorway. She had changed into simpler clothes, trying to look more motherly. "Daniel," she said softly, "we need to talk about what's best for our daughter." "Get out," Lillian screamed, clinging to her father. "Get out, I hate you." The machine started beeping faster as Daniel's heart rate increased. Dr. Roberts rushed in. "Everyone out," she ordered. "He needs rest." In the hallway, Rebecca faced Alexander. "You see? This environment isn't healthy for a child. Watching her father die living above a bakery, no mother's influence." "No mother's influence?" Margaret stepped forward, her usually gentle face fierce with anger. "Where was your mother's influence when she was hungry? When she had to steal bread? When she needed new shoes or school supplies or just a hug?" Rebecca stepped back, surprised by the older woman's fury. "I've changed," she insisted. "I have a good life now, a fresh start." "And that's wonderful for you," Margaret said coldly. "But Lillian isn't a fresh start. She's a little girl who needed her mother 5 years ago, not now when it's convenient." A small crowd had gathered, nurses, other patients' families, even Mrs. Peterson, who had been visiting her husband down the hall. They all watched as Rebecca's perfectly composed facade cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I was young, I was scared. I couldn't handle a sick husband and a baby, but I wasn't a baby when Dad got cancer," Lillian said quietly. Everyone turned. She had slipped out of her father's room unnoticed. "I was big enough to remember, big enough to be scared and hungry and wish my mom would come help us, but you never came." Rebecca reached for her daughter, but Lillian backed away. "I have a family now," she said. "Uncle Alex and Aunt Margaret and everyone at the bakery, even Mr. Thomas, who pretends to be grumpy but always saves me the best cookies. I don't need you anymore." The silence in the hallway was broken only by the steady beeping of machines from nearby rooms. Rebecca looked around at all the faces watching her, then down at her expensive shoes. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. After she left, Lillian let Alexander pick her up and hold her close, though she was really getting too big for it. "Did you mean it?" Margaret asked softly. "About me being Aunt Margaret?" Lillian nodded against Alexander's shoulder. "You take care of us. That's what family does." Back in Daniel's room, they found him sleeping peacefully. The monitors showed. His heart rate had stabilized. Dr. Roberts checked his charts. "He's fighting," she said, "for her." Alexander looked at his sleeping brother, at Lillian, who had climbed back onto the bed to hold her father's hand, at Margaret, who was arranging flowers by the window. His family, messy and broken and beautiful. "We all are," he said quietly. "We're all fighting for her." The next few days brought unexpected changes. Rebecca's lawyer contacted them, but not with custody papers. Instead, she was offering to sign away her parental rights. "She's gone back to California," the lawyer explained to Alexander. She says Lillian deserves better than someone who runs away when things get hard." Alexander shared the news with Daniel, whose condition had stabilized somewhat, though he remained very weak. "She did one good thing," Daniel said softly. "Finally." But their relief was short-lived. The hospital bills had reached astronomical amounts, and the bakery's income wasn't enough to cover them. Even with the town's support and fundraising efforts, they were drowning in debt. One morning, Alexander found James Warner waiting in his office. "Before you throw me out," Warner said quickly, "just listen. I've been thinking about what you said about family." He pulled out a thick envelope. "This is the deed to my bakery. I'm retiring. My daughter, the one I lost in the custody battle, she found me last month. She lives in Florida now, has kids of her own. She wants me to come live near them." Alexander stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to have my bakery. Not buy it, have it. Merge it with yours, expand your business. The only condition is that you keep my old employees and that you name one of your fancy pastries after my granddaughter. I don't "Understand," Alexander said. "Why would you do this?" Warner looked down at his hands. "Because watching you fight for your family, it reminded me of what's really important. And maybe helping you keep your family together will help make up for losing mine for so long." The merger of the two bakeries transformed Alexander's struggling business. With two locations and Warner's established customer base, they could finally keep up with the medical bills. But money wasn't their biggest concern anymore. Daniel was getting weaker every day. "I need you to promise me something," he said to Alexander one evening when they were alone. "Promise me you'll tell Lillian about the good times. Not just about when we were poor or when I was sick. Tell her about when we were kids playing in the bakery. Tell her about her grandparents. Tell her—" "You'll tell her yourself," Alexander interrupted, fighting back tears. Daniel smiled weakly. "We both know I won't. But it's okay, Alex. I'm not scared anymore. Lillian has you and Margaret. She has a home, a future. That's all I ever wanted for her." That night, Alexander found Lillian in the bakery kitchen, trying to make her father's favorite cinnamon rolls. "They're not coming out right," she said frustratedly, flour covering her face. "Here," Alexander said, coming to help. "Your dad taught me how to make these when we were young. The secret is in how you roll the dough." As they worked together, Alexander started telling her stories. "Did you know your dad once tried to bake a cake for your grandmother's birthday? He was about your age. He forgot to add flour, just mixed all the wet ingredients together and tried to bake it." Lillian giggled. "What happened? It was like soup, hot, chocolatey soup. But you know what? Your grandmother served it anyway, poured it into bowls and called it Daniel's special chocolate soup. That was the kind of person she was. She could find the good in any mistake." "Like Dad," Lillian said softly. "Exactly like your dad." They worked in silence for a while, the familiar smells of cinnamon and yeast filling the kitchen. "Uncle Alex," Lillian asked suddenly, "will you tell me more stories about Dad? About when he was little?" "Every day," Alexander promised. "And we'll make all his favorite recipes and hang his drawings in the gallery once it's built. He'll always be part of our family, Lillian. Always." The next morning, Margaret arrived early to find them both, asleep in the kitchen, surrounded by slightly lopsided but perfectly edible cinnamon rolls. "These are really good," she said after trying one. "Dad's recipe," Lillian said proudly. "Uncle Alex says we can sell them in the bakery. We're going to call them Daniel's Heavenly Cinnamon Rolls." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Perfect name." They took a batch to the hospital, but Daniel was too weak to eat them. Still, he smiled at the name. "Heavenly, huh?" he whispered. "Save me some for later." Alexander held his brother's hand, remembering all the times they'd baked together as children, all the dreams they'd shared, all the years they'd lost to pride and stubbornness. "I will," he promised. "They'll be waiting for you." But they both knew it was a promise he wouldn't have to keep. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In the bakery across the street, lights were coming on, warming the gathering darkness. Life would go on. There would be more sunsets, more fresh bread, more stories to tell, and through it all love would remain, in memories, in recipes passed down, in the legacy of a father who had nothing to give his daughter except his heart, and a brother who learned that true wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in the people who gather around your table. Daniel passed away quietly on a Tuesday morning, just as the first batch of bread was coming out of the ovens at the bakery. Alexander was holding his hand, and Lillian was curled up asleep in the chair beside the bed. "Take care of my girl," were his last words, whispered so softly Alexander barely heard them. "Always," Alexander promised. "Rest now, little brother, just rest." Telling Lillian was the hardest thing Alexander had ever done. She didn't cry at first, just stared at him with those big eyes that looked so much like her father's. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "No, sweetheart, he just went to sleep." Then the tears came and Alexander held her while she sobbed, his own tears falling into her hair. The whole town turned out for the funeral. The bakery closed for the day, the first time. In 50 years it hadn't opened its doors. Even James Warner came, standing quietly at the back of the church. Mrs. Peterson and her church group brought enough food to feed an army. Thomas and the other bakery employees handled all the arrangements. Margaret never left Alexander and Lillian's side, her quiet strength holding them together. After the service, they found Rebecca standing by Daniel's grave. She looked different, simpler, sadder, more real somehow. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quickly when Alexander tensed. "I just needed to say goodbye, and to give Lillian something." She held out a small photo album. "These are pictures from when you were a baby, Lillian. When we were a family, your father, he was a good man. I was too young and stupid to see it then, but I see it now." Lillian took the album carefully. "Thank you," she said formally. Rebecca nodded, then turned to Alexander. "Take good care of her. Better than I did." "I will," Alexander said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something like peace. Life gradually found a new rhythm. The bakery thrived with its 2 locations. Alexander hired more staff so he could spend more time with Lillian. The art gallery next door was coming along nicely. They planned to open it on what would have been Daniel's birthday. One morning, about a month after the funeral, Alexander found Lillian in the kitchen at 4 a.m. trying to make bread. "I couldn't sleep," she explained. "I miss Dad." "Me too," Alexander said, pulling out ingredients to help her. "Want to hear a story about him?" Lillian nodded, measuring flour with careful concentration. "When we were kids, your dad used to sneak down here at night too. Said the bakery was magic at night, when everything was quiet and dark except the ovens. He would make the most amazing things, not always edible, mind you, but amazing." "Like what?" "Once he made a bread sculpture of a dragon. It looked terrible and tasted worse, but he was so proud of it. Dad, your grandfather, had kept it on display for weeks until it got moldy." Lillian giggled, then grew serious. "I'm afraid I'll forget him." "You won't," Alexander assured her. "He's right here in this kitchen, in every recipe he taught us, in every story we tell about him. And look," he pointed to her hands kneading the dough. "You do that exactly like he did, not the way I taught you, the way he did it. Some things just stay in our hearts. The bread they made that morning wasn't perfect. It was a little lopsided, a little too dark on top. But when they cut into it, the smell was exactly right." "Dad would love this," Lillian said. "Yes, he would." Later, that day, Mrs. Thompson visited the bakery. She had all the final paperwork for Alexander's adoption of Lillian. "Everything's in order," she said, smiling. "The court date is just a formality now. Congratulations, Mr. Remington. You're officially going to be a father." Alexander looked through the kitchen doorway where Lillian was teaching Thomas how to make her father's cinnamon rolls. She was wearing a child-sized apron with Junior Baker embroidered on it, a gift from Margaret. "I already am," he said softly. That evening, after closing, Alexander found a drawing Lillian had done. It showed the bakery with all of them standing in front. Him, Lillian, Margaret, Thomas, Mrs. Peterson, even James Warner in the background. And floating above them, with wings made of bread and a halo of cinnamon rolls, was Daniel. At the bottom, she had written, "My family, some in heaven, some on earth, all in my heart." Alexander carefully pinned the drawing to the bulletin board in the kitchen, right next to the original recipe for Daniel's cinnamon rolls. Tomorrow it would be the first piece to hang in the new gallery. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the distant sound of the late train and the rustle of leaves in the autumn wind. Inside, the bakery was warm and fragrant with the smell of fresh bread and memories. Margaret came up behind him, looking at the drawing. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time we made some changes of our own." Alexander turned to look at her, this woman who had stood by him through everything. "What kind of changes?" She smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Well, Lillian needs a mother, a real one who will never leave. And I need the family I never thought I'd have." In the silence that followed, Alexander could almost hear Daniel laughing with joy. 1 year later, the bakery was decorated with white flowers again. But this time, instead of being alone in front of a mirror, Alexander stood at the altar with Margaret beside him, both of them beaming as Lillian walked down the aisle scattering rose petals. The whole town had turned out for the wedding. Mrs. Peterson had organized the flower arrangements. Thomas had baked the wedding cake using Daniel's secret recipe. Even James Warner was there, proudly showing pictures of his grandchildren to anyone who would look. "Your father would be so happy," Margaret whispered to Lillian as they got ready that morning. "He always said Uncle Alex needed someone to remind him what really matters in life." Lillian smoothed her flower girl dress, purple of course. "Dad knew you loved Uncle Alex. He told me once in the hospital. He said you were the only person who could handle both Remington brothers being stubborn." Now, standing in the same church where they had said goodbye to Daniel a year ago, Alexander and Margaret exchanged their vows. Lillian stood between them, holding both their hands as they promised to love each other and her forever. The reception was held at the bakery. Both bakeries, actually, with the street closed off between them. Tables loaded with food stretched as far as the eye could see. The centerpiece was a giant bread sculpture of a dragon, created by the bakery staff in honor of Daniel. "Not quite as ugly as Dad's original," Lillian told Alexander, making him laugh. Through his tears, the art gallery next door was finally open, its walls covered with Daniel's drawings. The centerpiece was Lillian's family portrait, now professionally framed. Beside it hung a new drawing she had made, the same scene, but with Margaret now standing hand in hand with Alexander, and Daniel's bread-winged angel smiling down at them, all. As evening fell, Alexander found himself standing in the old bakery kitchen with Margaret and Lillian. "I have something for both of you," he said, pulling out 2 small boxes. Inside each was a key on a purple ribbon. "These are copies of the original bakery key," he explained. "The one my father gave me and his father gave him. Because this isn't just my family's bakery anymore. It's our family's bakery." Lillian hugged him tight. "Does this mean I can come make dragon bread at midnight whenever I want?" "Only if you clean up afterward," Margaret laughed, wiping happy tears from her eyes. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the street had been cleaned up, the 3 of them sat in the kitchen sharing a piece of wedding cake. "I had a dream about Dad last night," Lillian said suddenly. "He was wearing a baker's hat and wings made of bread, just like in my drawing. He said he was proud of us." "He is proud," Alexander assured her. "And he's still with us, in every loaf of bread we bake, every story we tell, every time we make his cinnamon rolls. And in you," Margaret added, "you have his creativity, his kindness, his way of seeing the magic in ordinary things." Lillian smiled, then yawned. It had been a long day. "Time for bed," Margaret said. "Tomorrow's another early morning at the bakery." As they walked up to their apartment, expanded now to take up the whole upper floor, Lillian stopped to look at a new photo on the wall. It showed the 3 of them in their wedding clothes, standing in front of the bakery. Next to it hung an old photo of 2 young boys covered in flour, grinning at the camera. "You and Dad?" she asked. Alexander nodded. His first day learning to bake. He was terrible at it, but he never gave up. "Just like you never gave up on him," Margaret said softly. "Or on Lillian or on love." In her room, under the purple ceiling with its painted clouds, Lillian fell asleep quickly. Alexander and Margaret stood in the doorway watching her. "Thank you," Alexander whispered to his new wife. "For what? For loving us. For being the mother Lillian deserves. For making our family complete." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Thank you for letting a little girl steal bread that night. For opening your heart when it would have been easier to close it. For showing me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love." Outside, the street was quiet. The bakery signs glowed softly in the darkness. Remington and Warner Family Bakery on one side, Daniel's Gallery on the other. Tomorrow they would open early, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. But tonight, in the apartment above the bakery, a family slept peacefully, and somewhere, a baker's son with bread wings smiled down on them all, knowing that sometimes the best recipes aren't for bread at all, but for healing hearts and making families whole again. The magic of that first stolen loaf of bread had transformed them all, turning strangers into family, healing old wounds and proving that love, like good bread, only needs the right ingredients and a warm place to rise. And in the quiet kitchen below, tomorrow's dough was already rising, ready to begin. Another story, another day, another chance to share the simple miracle of bread and love and family.